Hi, Peter. Sorry, I'm late. Oh, that worked. A treat.
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
Happens to the best of us. No, that's the wrong way. So I'm using my phone as the camera again, which is so bizarre and so much cooler. Anyway.
How are you getting it to stay on?
As in stay in the space.
Yeah, and not fall off. Is it like taped on, or do you have some sort of fastening clamp? Ah, ooh, that looks really cool.
It does, doesn't it? It wasn't even very expensive. It's a little bit short, so because you asked the question, I'm going to put something under it. Yeah, I'm going to. Whoops! I hope that didn't hurt any of you, falling down like that. Boom, boom, boom. Sorry, this is not very attractive. Oh, at an angle now. Anyway, yeah, Mark, I made it on time. It even got my water and coffee, so all is good. So the meeting we're having on Thursday, Mark, you've seen the emails too, right? So we're saying 2 p.m. UK time. Megan is joining us. Just like a super quick brief to you guys. There are all kinds of specifics that they are interested in, but I think we should try to talk much more from the consumer's perspective. And that's where you and Megan come in, Peter. And Mark, I think your contribution will be, no, it doesn't work like that here. And then we'll just see how it goes. And of course, this will be transcribed for an issue of the journal. So it should be fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Because I can speak from the perspective of both the lawyer and the programmer who's working on a possible legal application drawing on the database. So
exactly. So also to share with you guys, the Future of Text Symposium will most likely be on the 26th of October. It will most likely be in London. It will most likely therefore be hybrid. So we'll have to find out what that means. And as you saw today, I took it upon myself to send an email to everyone about how things connect and how things are readable, a little bit of a return to our roots. So I thought that it's fantastic, our monthly meetings. I think they bring real value when transcribed. But maybe we should have some themed ones that we've discussed. And that's kind of the start of that. That's it, really.
you know, one thing that might be nice for a meeting would be just to have one dedicated to an overview of famous past hypertext systems, just sort of like review the history, talk a little about Ted's work, talk a little bit about.
I have no idea who could possibly mark that. I mean, Mark, I have no idea who.
Yeah, then again, so that would need a bit of a run up. The interesting thing is I keep finding myself thinking at the moment about sort of VR or XR or whatever we want to call it, and spatial hypertext, which aren't the same things, but I think have almost a conceptual overlap. I mean, in that I understand that spatial hypertext actually came out of a slightly different area. It was almost a thing of, you know, if you imagine on a sort of two-dimensional plane, you know, where you are is what you are. And at the time, this was sort of like I can't remember whether it was cycle 1 or cycle 2 of AI, and people had very grandiose ideas that essentially that everything was logically decomposable. And you know, just required a bit of effort to put things in the right order and it all makes sense. Of course, we continue to learn that it's not quite that simple. But nonetheless, the idea of we've touched on previous discussions. Hi, Brandel. That you know, this idea that from a different starting place, you still get to this point that where something is what it is and what it means, and that can be enough to have, you know, salience within whatever you're doing. And so lots of things are nibbling around the edge of it. And I certainly, my sort of take is I'm less worried about the formalisms because I think that just tends to lead to religious warfare. Much more interesting is to look at the thing and say, this is something people seem to be able to grok quite easily, and they don't have to be, we sort of understand putting, sorting in this loose way. And the funny thing is that we're actually, I think often we're more comfortable with the looseness than we are often with the formality, because with formality we have to learn the rules, whereas knowing that these things are not the same as those things is quite easy to do. So in other words, it seems often we make a problem for ourselves by trying to make things too hard-edged when they don't need to be. Now, obviously, in the digital domain, that there's an interesting translation has to happen, because at some point, once it hits code, it has to have some degree of sort of rigidity to it, because a computer can't think in quite those fuzzy ways. But still, in a sense, on the presentation layer, having things that are very loosely structured seems to me actually quite a powerful thing.
Yeah, we can go all the way back to memory palaces, right? Brandel, just really briefly, we were going through, I've been in discussion with Windsurf today. We're most likely going to be hosting the Future of Text Symposium in London around the 26th of October. So it will be hybrid, but if you could be here, that would be fantastic. Peter, I fully expect you to swim across the ocean as well. Brandel has a mountain and a continent. Also, we're now talking a little bit about having discussions around topics like the email that I sent out earlier. And we're going to have a meeting tomorrow, quite a bit earlier, about this whole law, business regulations in the UK. So I don't
Thursday,
think,
not tomorrow.
not tomorrow, Thursday, absolutely. Probably not of interest to you, Brandel, but it will be recorded and transcribed. And we are working with the foundation that this has to be VR ready, or rather really rich media ready. It's not just one document links to another.
By the by, Fred, is there any sort of even the loosest brief document as to what this project, in other words, what the commissioning organization?
BEIS.
I'm just thinking, because the classic thing is to just work out just how far from reality their starting position is, which is often what happens with these things.
Oh, it's quite far, and there are lots of issues, and I want you to ignore all of them. I think we have an opportunity here for our community to really have an initial deep dialogue on what it means to make legislation accessible, because that in itself is not straightforward. And if we say, because this is business regulation, if the end user is a business person, then the only thing they will be interested in is what is actionable, which is only two questions. And Peter, stop me if you don't agree. One is, am I allowed to do this? And the other one is, oh, do I have to do this?
Dead on.
Thank you. So it comes into how law is a human construct with all the fallibilities. So just as you were talking about, Mark, there will be things encoded in different levels, and they will interfere with other things. That is how it will work. So to help people navigate this will be interesting. But my kind of contribution to talking to the company today was, okay, maybe we are not building a full front end at this point, but what we may want to do with the API is build a reverse API interface, meaning that the legislators and governments can really analyze the use of the API. So they can see that when you looked at this document, you afterwards looked at that document and you came from this region. Why are there so many people in this region constantly referring to these two documents and so on? So they can better analyze the basic understanding of this legislation.
Yeah, it's interesting too that it seems to be in various discussions with people, including my in-house lawyer, about this. My wife's now retired commercial lawyer, so he does a lot of contract work. So meanings of things take on a new meaning. Is that there is a sort of there's a slightly smushing together in my mind between when we talk about legislation and broadly sort of regulation rules. So the rules that say, you know, the plug must have this many pins is fairly hard edged. But the more you move into the more pure law, the more it in a sense becomes something that has to be debated. It works on, you know, previous examples, because often it is actually quite difficult to define things as explicitly as we imagine we'd like them to, and therefore it's case by case that the law is sort of affirmed or altered, which says to me that one of the delineations it's therefore useful to make, but one that we don't tend to do, is to work out what, you know, in a sense, what reasonably has definitions that we can give to people in a way that aren't just causing a new confusion. Because just because I can look something up and I'm told, you know, it's this or that, often unavoidably there's more complexity behind it. So in other words, understanding what it's safe to tell people is effectively a sort of, you know, binary yes no hard edge thing, without basically unintentionally steering them into danger because they act on that and then something goes wrong.
Yeah, this is an absolute hell issue of being stuck in where if something is made apparent in one way and it's just not right. I see you have your hand up, Peter, which is great. I just wanted to say on this issue that, I don't know, I'm sure you can say it much better than me, Peter, please.
Okay, I was wondering, do you have the equivalent of, well, in American tax law, there's a concept of a private letter ruling. And I don't know if you have anything like that there, but basically what will happen is some transactions involve so much risk that no one would undertake them unless they knew what the regulatory agency's treatment of the transaction would be ahead of time. So the Internal Revenue Service introduced this notion of a private letter ruling, which is basically, there's something that I want to do. Normally, I'd have to do it first and be blown out of the world if I turned out to have guessed wrong. So instead, I will present a hypothetical to the agency and ask it, what would your tax treatment of this action be if I did exactly this, boom, 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 with all the little bullet points and the details. And then they will get back a private letter ruling, which will say how the agency would treat them if they engaged in everything as presented. However, it's not taken to be binding or have any impact on any other parties, hence the private notion, but there's been a movement over time to try and maybe make those things searchable so that people can draw on it and use it for guidance. Because the real killer problem is that under American law and the system of jurisprudence, you have to wait until there's an actual case in controversy before you can get a court to rule on something. And again, the risk, if they rule in the wrong direction, is so high, they would absolutely shut down all sorts of major transactions and commercial activity if someone had to be willing to engage in a bet the business dice roll, basically, to go through, litigate the question, and then see what the outcome is. So I'm wondering if there's something like that in the British regulatory system, and if so, could that get linked in with the regulation too, so that you could jump direct from the regulation to those kinds of rulings, or at least maybe like have a count associated with it, so that you could see which areas people have been writing in with questions to the agency, which would serve as like a little hot red flag area that, ooh, this is the portion of the regulation I need to be paying attention to.
Peter, that's digging really deep into law, which is probably a bit out of scope for our discussion today. And what you really are highlighting is that it is complicated.
Yeah, well, I think the point that Peter's making is that in practice, in a number of countries, there's regulation, as Mark indicated, is fairly hard-edged. There's legislation, which is typically still fairly hard-edged. If you look at things like the Crimes Act in New Zealand and presumably the UK, most things about what are petty crimes and various things are solved there, rather than in what Peter's kind of getting to, which is common law. Most former colonial countries use some mixture of the three, but the extent to which they rely on each of them varies depending on how people have kind of interpreted that. You have countries like Italy that have no common law whatsoever, but yeah, like in practice, for various reasons, the United States has decided that common law is its favorite thing. Maybe because its legislators failed to legislate. I'm not sure. But yeah, I would be curious as to the extent to which regulation butts up against common law in that sense, because I would hope, expect/hope that they are sort of separated by some level of legislative sort of authority in between before having to kind of go all the way in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I look forward to Mark's comment. However, it is quite out of scope for this particular project because this is about business regulation.
Mhm.
So it is a really interesting question, but thankfully goes a bit further. But yeah, Mark.
Yeah, and very quickly. I mean, I should check because I'm sat not far from someone who might know. I mean, I know that who because you work for a large international engineering / Almonds firm, British Aerospace. So they had some quite gnarly risk problems. And I don't know. I think here it's mainly done by getting counsel's opinion. So you basically go and see a very high priced lawyer who basically is, one of the two people you'll end up dealing with if it goes to court. So it's kind of a similar sort of process, but not quite as formal as you're discussing. Yeah, I listening to this, what it makes me think is that something that is quite difficult to do is to get to the heart of what it is the people who want this done sort of really think that they can achievably do. Because I know what will happen at the moment. They'll just want progress.
No,
They
but
want something
Mark,
that looks good.
no,
And it's all good intent, but it's
Mark, no. That's reality you're talking about. That is not what the discussion with us is about. We're not trying to kind of understand the process and the reality. Aspasia knows a lot about that, and I could comment on a lot of the kind of who they are in government and all of that stuff. I think we should be a little bit idealistic. And of course, you have very important real world experience, but I'm saying, what would an ideal system of basic regulations be like for the end users?
Yes, but that speaks to something different to what I was raising, which is that it's just that the technology or the suggestions we make about how we may do things are still, no matter how well intentioned we are, still opinionated.
Yeah.
And so what's behind my question is to try and make the match between effectively our implicit opinion in the way we suggest things with what the people asking for this, who are effectively the people generating the request, really think they may get out of it. Because what I'm thinking about is the danger of the two being slightly divergent. So you suggest something that is in a sense sensible and fit for purpose, but the purpose is not quite the one that it was intended for, through nobody's mistake, except by failing to be explicit enough about the tractable cases within the overall exciting envelope of what can be done. And I think it gets back to this difficult thing at what point simple and unambiguous regulation basically wanders across into legislation that can often only be tested by a court.
Yeah, but I really think that's out of scope for our community. I think our community is basically looking at, because this can be generalized to other forms of data, right? So the idea is that somebody has published a bunch of rules.
Well, that's kind of scary talk when you say this can be generalized too. That makes me worry a lot, because generalized because it's convenient, or generalized because we really, really know that these things actually have a commonality beyond having data. That's, and I don't mean that in a adversarial sense, but that's the thing that I think I see going wrong the most when using these sort of systems, is that I have a template. This template I can put wherever I like, And actually, rarely do they fit that well, or not without some very, very careful shimming or remaking.
I'm just saying that there are issues with government, there are issues with law, there is issue with regulations. I think what we've been asked to look at is, if we assume that it can be made an input mechanism, which in itself is a technical and human challenge, if that can be done, in what way can we add value to the end users? The end users being the legislators putting it online, which is of course not a uniform group, and of course the individual small business user, as well as the technical person who is putting it into what they call RegTech, regulation technology. The RegTech people, I don't care about that much because they scrape anyway, and they resell it at high inflated prices that rich companies can afford. But the dialogue, okay, I'm going a bit deeper than I should, but this is what I talked to Aspasia today. What I strongly recommended is, even though the alpha stage, and this is not alpha, beta, and software, but ABC and this kind of stuff. In the alpha stage, they have done all kinds of research, another company, but it's time to do some of it again. The first thing we need to do is ask three groups: the legislator type people, the end user business person, and the technical, those three. But what their requirements are, the whole normal stuff. But I think a really important thing will be, once that is done, present to all of them the findings and ask them again. Because the legislator may say that, oh no, what they're asking for here is just not possible for these reasons, or the other way around. So it'll either raise red flags or it'll highlight further thinking. Once that is done, we'd try to get something like 5 use cases, such as, where can I put plugs in a house? That level of simple, or whatever these user group things are important. So then we can say, okay, we need these results to come to really highlight. Let's not forget, as you keep saying, Mark, you're completely right. This is a political thing. The political leaders want to be able to tell their other political leaders, look what I've done. So these are the case studies to walk around. The later stuff about, some kind of an ontology, because there are different groups, will be interesting. All of that stuff will come later. But what I think our community can do is to be very idealistic and say, we really would like an environment where this kind of a thing can be checked. Because one thing I really want to hear from Peter and also from Megan is the yes buts. Like, the yes, but you see this regulation. But what you need to know might be something like, what was before it, so you can compare, etc. Right? We need to see the lawyer's perspective and so on. And I think that this is all encoded in text, of course. And it is a very interesting case of how text has huge power, but also how we interact with text. That's why I think it's really, really interesting for our community to engage with, while at the same time, to a degree, ignoring the realities of how ridiculous this is. This shouldn't just go up for tender. This should be a proper research project, for crying out loud. There are many things that should be done, and it isn't. Fair enough. Maybe we can provide some headroom. But what is really interesting here is, almost everything we look at for VR stuff can be done in traditional screens. And it's an honest and real thing. I mean, I keep bringing up this amazing camera that I have. I'm all interested in doing video, looping videos. That's my art form, fleetingmoment.org. But I find out that there's so much that I can get out of a single still image. So the fact that we're going into VR most certainly doesn't mean we should live in VR all the time, right? But the fact that Brandel has given us the freedom to think like that is amazing. And to go into something as important as legislation, further down the line, I could imagine we literally allow the consumer of legislation to go through different versions of a library. How it was filed. There's so many things we can do to help them think, like you were talking about spatial hypertext. Also for them, again, to see how legislation has been viewed in different parts of the country over time, to see how it impacts them, how change, all of that stuff. It's fascinating. Sorry about that long speech, Peter.
Okay, a couple thoughts. I'd like to have a concordance so that I can see what terms are used where across the entire database of all the regulations. Quite often, I want to see how something has been used in another context, because you'll have terminology that gets reused, and lots of times the legislator will be lifting a term that they use in some other body of legislation and applying a slightly different context. And if we explicitly made that link possible and viewable, you could follow that and then get.
Hang on, this is really important, Peter. I don't mean to stop you. I mean to slow you down to get it. So the first thing, when you say concordance, it's like a glossary, but it's not just out of nowhere. It is a glossary where it's explained where it's from, right?
Yes.
So
You can find where it's been used, where it was defined.
but where it was used earlier in time, or earlier by organization, or earlier by person, or how would that be done? Or is it a manual thing?
Actually, both dimensions. I'd be interested in the temporal evolution of statute. That's another thing. Sometimes you'll refer back to a previous version because the change between two versions of a statute is significant. And that helps you arrive at what the legislative intent was. Say you're a judge now and you're doing the adjudication process. You're not just going to look at the text of the statute, but you're also going to refer to the legislative history, and previous versions of the statute are relevant. So if you see that, the language used to be A, and they changed the wording to B, they wouldn't have done that unless they had a reason for doing it. Let's look at what the interpretation and meaning of A used to be, and now we see that the change has been made, and we'll make sure that we apply that, and we don't just accidentally default to what it was before, because they wouldn't have changed it if they didn't actually intend to change it. So the meaning of a section in a previous iteration is relevant to interpreting a new iteration. So you have the temporal dimension, and then you also have the structural organization of the document, because in one subsection of regulations, a term might be specialized. It's almost like an object-oriented programming scheme where you'll be sort of overriding what the default is and applying a more relevant to the subsection context. So you'll sometimes say, for purposes of this section, now we have the slightly altered definition of a term.
Yeah, that sounds like it might take a lot of human curation, but that is, of course.
Yeah, what you'd really want, I think, to do it right would be to have a domain-specific language describing sort of a rough ontology and put that in a tool for the legislators to be using, so that to their mind, they're just like applying word styles. And it just happens to be that the word style they're applying has semantics in the ontology that would enable software to automatically pull that out. Also, if I had an API of the legislation and regulations, it should be at a level where it could be dropped into a generic expert system shell that would provide basic navigation. So instead of paging through hyperlinks, the system could guide you through the linkages, and it would be based upon, actually, there's a great book I recommend, Peter Sell, Introduction to Expert Systems. It was a very thin volume, came out in like 1980s-ish, could have been a hair earlier. And it described a very simple Lisp-like language, what functionality you'd want in a generic expert system. Really excellent volume, because it's at a high enough level that a non-programmer can really sort of wrap your head easily around what it's doing. And it's talking about the coarse-grained facilities that should be present. You want to be able to have the user of the expert system at any point interrupt and ask why. Why did you ask me this question? And then it will say, I asked you this question because it's relevant to answering a sub-question under Rule 12, say, and I need to answer Rule 12 in order to get at Rule 7, and the outcome of Rule 7 gives you the answer that you were asking for to start from. So it can basically automatically chain you through that navigation of the rule structure. And I think that'd be absolutely invaluable to end users. But for the API consumer, what you'd want would be to get it out in a format that you could just drop that into whatever custom expert system shell you're building. So you want to be able to get out in terms of production rules, linking the questions that are raised by the legislation in order to answer. So I guess you'd have a set of propositions that the legislation controls the definition of, and then for the definition of each proposition, you have a series of predicates, and the predicates are what the expert system would be chaining through to arrive at the answers to the questions.
Yeah, that sounds ideal, but it sounds really difficult to make that happen. What do you think?
So basically, I think what you need would be to have the legislators using a structure editor to be able to produce it. Could be kind of like the snap programming language where you give them blocks. And the goal in that sort of an environment is to provide an editor where it's impossible to snap something together that isn't internally logically consistent. So if you give them this, they might have a block that could be, 3-pronged test could be a block, and you drag one block out that'd be, here's what the question is. So the question block would have a spot to snap sub-conditions into, and you have a condition block, and you snap the condition block in, and then the condition could be defined by, subjective balance, hard factual predicate, or, multi-pronged test, each of which could be a recursive subset of the above kinds of structures. So what we need is a nice, relatively simple, abstract representation of those components of a regulation, stick that in a structure editor for the regulators to be using, so they can't put something together that has logical inconsistencies hard baked into it. There was some interesting work in, I think, maybe the early 90s using Prolog to try to model in Prolog statutes and look for logical inconsistencies in them. And I don't know whatever became of that thread of research. I think it just sort of died away with interest in Prolog at the time. But
Yeah,
there is some existing work that had been done along those lines. But you'd want the people who are drafting the legislation to have the authoring software ensure that it didn't have any hard contradictions baked into it. And that could help in the authoring process, and then it would give you data out that could be easily streamed through the API to be accessed by.
so basically now you're talking about writing software to write laws. I would
Yes.
love to do that. I think it is way out of scope for this, but I think it is way in scope for us to discuss.
And
Brandel,
maybe
or
talk
Mark,
about now could help get interest from people who'd be interested in funding that kind of work, and let them know that we're the group that you should be talking to if you're moving in that direction.
yeah, but part of the problem with politics, though, is they don't always want you to know how the sausage was made, right?
Ooh, good point.
It's like Robert's rules or whatever it's called. Mark or Brandel.
Let Brando go first.
Okay.
I was gonna say, based on my understanding and interaction with politicians in the past, which has been indirect. My wife used to work in the business. It's like committee of one kind or other. It was about what the Crown enterprises were and how they conducted their affairs, and she was tipped to clerk a regs review, but had a baby, and so I did that. So a few things. Legislators and regulators, to some extent, don't even use computers, let alone fancy rich things. So it's in terms of who's sort of on the hook to interpret and decide how to make sure things fit into formalisms. That's not something that's top of mind for anybody who comes anywhere within 60 feet of a decision. And the second thing that I was gonna I'm a big believer in understanding the political nature of a decision arena and what people are actually looking for. So in the context of this business regulations, it's really important to keep that at the top of mind, because like I said, there's a vast difference between there's different shades of common law to legislation to regulation. If this is for business regulations, why did people agree to even tender it? What are the problems that people leaned on in order to kind of twist somebody's arm in order to greenlight some money for it. And what's the vague shape of the solutions that they have in mind already? I think those are essential to being able to see what kind of problems are being most acutely felt and the way to solve them. And then, a neat solution that some people have for these is come up with the minimal thing you can do as a prototype to say, like, we've solved this problem. How do you use it? Imagine that we've actually built this already. What are you going to do with it, and how do you expect it to give you answers and stuff like that? Because focusing on the users and what they need. So it might be lawyers, it really might be, but it might be business owners. Ultimately, if it's successful, then
there are specific. I was just going to say there are specific user groups set up.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And ultimately, the thing that is going to be the primary determinant, and this is not just as my position as a marketer, but the primary determinant for the success of such a program would be that people know it exists and know to use it at all. And so it is essentially marketing. So it's worth knowing how they might know. And how they might use it as and what they might use it for, in order to make sure that it does that job. And in terms of like completeness, unfortunately, the soundness and completeness of a system is often at odds with how well it does its best thing, the thing that it needs to do best, and it's worth really, particularly if something is public facing, considering like, how can we pave the easiest thing? What are the, Wikipedia is an incredible trove of information for phenomenal quantities of people, but the top 25 articles account for an incredible amount of traffic. And it's for the best that Wikipedia as an organization is aware of how important those top 25 articles are at any given moment, to make sure that the experience is smooth, that people are sort of shepherded through it gracefully, and they know what they're supposed to be getting and why people are visiting those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So many points there, but I think it is nice to have coffee shop discussions about politics and law in general. Absolutely, and we've been watching The Good Wife's final episode yesterday. So in terms of, one aspect of the whole legal thing is, so awful. But I think what we have here is an opportunity, just like we're trying to define what spatial hypertext is again. What is hypertext? We're trying to be idealists. So I think real value that our community can provide here is saying, if you guys are serious about this law stuff, and about when you're ready to move from pen and paper into digital, because you're completely right. These high-level people they use their laptop for an email and that's about it. Absolutely. But if we can spark some dialogue, and we have our tiny little journal, then maybe somebody in the future can say, look, these people have already thought about it. Here are some great case scenarios. I think we can be inspirational, and that's about it. Mark.
Yeah, the thing that I think is coming out from this is the need to find the sort of the tractable examples, which speaks to Brandal's point about, well, what can you actually do now? Because you're absolutely right, trying to build it too broadly, because a large organization will inherently ask you to build the whole thing, because in their mind's eye, that's the problem that they understand.
That is
whereas that is not, any kind person would not let them do that. So that's one of the areas I think, where we should look to explore.
No, but that's been covered. Finding the small user community that fits. Absolutely. That's something I've already said. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm beginning to see that this is more about process. So the structure of the law or whatever actually just becomes a sort of bounding condition, but is in a way less interested than the fact that you've got two sides with quite disparate things. in terms of when I say two sides, I'm thinking less about the government or whatever, but more about those who basically define the laws, the lawyers, or those who are the drafters of the laws, and the users of this potential service. Because from the user side, one of the things, actually, one of the biggest problems is the unknown unknowns. Something that tells you these are the known things, but that's not your problem, because one difficulty of systems is they present certainty where it doesn't actually exist, without telling you that, look, these things are certain, but this is only a subset of what applies to the question you're actually answering. So that's, I think, a really interesting challenge to take on board, and to think about whether some of the techniques and things we've looked at offer some tractability in that sphere to which may be, even if all it does is to get people to understand that, right, you've found this information, but you need to understand it's sort of like this much right. So because it's interesting, it sort of goes back to what Peter was asking about earlier, and whether I've already forgotten the name of the process, but if you have something that's potentially risky, you might go and have effectively a preemptive judgment or indicative judgment made for you, so you have confidence to do it. So if I go ahead on this, so that's one of the things I think is almost becomes a necessity in this. So one of the things that this sort of process needs to be able to define is that actually the person using it has confidence that if they obey the rules that they are presented with, which is effectively what will happen, that they are therefore entitled to act on that, and not be subject. Basically, if they're misinformed by the system, then it shouldn't be actionable to them, because the mistake is not theirs. They've been fed incorrect information. The flip side is you then have to look about, did they ask the right question? Because we always blame the other party in this thing. So the one of the mapping problems then is understanding what, when somebody says in the open-ended way, well, I just want to do this, it's actually then working out how to actually lay that back onto the problem space. I actually find the classification of the law is a complex thing, but actually I don't find that it's challenging only in its size and scale. Less, I think, than far harder is to seeing that when you go in, you say, I just want to know how far off the floor my plugs need to be. Sounds very simple. I'm sure it actually isn't, in a sense, when you look at all the things that might come out of it, if you take into account the liabilities that may arise from it. And that is the problem, that what's unintentionally being suggested is something I can see exactly what's happening. Well, look, instead of actually having to go and use a high-priced person to do this, you'll go and feed your question into the API. The answer will come back 64. You'll go and act on that, and everything is absolutely fine right up to the point where 64 turns out to not be the right answer.
Yeah. So the way there's a few elements to this so far. One is having added value, machine learning, AI, graphs, and all of that good stuff has to be very carefully looked at. And also even how to, I hate the phrase add metadata. I think that's very dangerous. We should look at it as in trying to find out what metadata there already is. These are really important issues. It's also, the legal aspect of it is beyond scope. I saw this horrible thing on Twitter today. It was from the United States of America, where it turns out that this was regarding the school shooting recently, how the police are actually not legally obliged to protect you, because that's common practice, and Scalia wrote it and all of these things. So there are all these human sides of the law, absolutely. But remember that, as I think, I don't know which one of you said it, there is regulations, and then there's kind of the stuff on top of it. These are two different aspects in this system as well. So what we're really talking about is, here's a regulation written up A4 type thing, present that in a useful way to people, and then have useful ways to interact with it so that they can do the questions that Peter talked about earlier. Why has the language changed? What was the language? Useful things like that could be, there's a term in here. I want to see how it was used before this document was made, not after, for instance. because that shows how that word, what the meaning was. All these things can be done there, but they do have to be very manual. So it is the user who is asking the question. And if they ask a bullshit question and get a bullshit answer, that's not something that's going to bring the government down. But if there is so much analysis provided to the citizen, that analysis becomes kind of legal advice to begin with. So yeah, we need to be careful. Mr. Wasilko.
Yes, another thought is it'd be incredibly useful from an end user perspective if the regulatory database system could be integrated with the court calendar system so that I could find out, let's say that the law has a provision for some sort of procedure where you can go and ask for one of 2 or 3 different kinds of hearings, say. If the system would tell you what the scheduling time lag is associated with each one of your options. So you can know option 1 would give me an answer within 1 month. Option 2, which might look really, really attractive in terms of what it's doing in the law-wise side of it, might have a 6-year backlog on cases. And if you choose to pursue option 2, you're not going to get an answer for 6 years. So if you had that kind of metadata, and also the system should be able to automatically generate a statistical estimate of what the cost of different options are. Let's say option 1 is a 2-step process.
Peter, no, that's what the RegTech providers can do for exactly the reason Mark mentioned. If there is an analysis of statistical, anything like that, then that becomes a bias of how the information is being presented. So, you should be able to have API calls to make that, but someone else would have to make that the system for that, I think. We have to be really, really
I want the API to be able to, at least I should be able to query the API and find out what the statutory fees are associated with everything. A RegTech provider could do some survey of the private market and find out what the additional costs would be outside of the hard costs that are baked into the statute. So you might even imagine, say, some association of realtors getting together and deciding to mutually, and there's actually been some talk on the law side about these kinds of structures. Say the Realtor Association would get all of its members to agree that they would share what their legal billing expenses were on a certain class of matter, so that the organization could then provide aggregate information to all of them. So you'd know, if you hadn't done this particular kind of thing before, here's what it costs the other members of our association to resolve this kind of issue in terms of our internal legal fees and things. And that would be completely separate from the regulatory database from the government perspective. But on the government side, the API should be able to tell you what the hard statutory fees are associated with different matters. And if it's something that's iterative, it should be able to provide you with the hard statistic of what the average number of rounds of iteration are.
Yeah, but now we're going a little far away from the basic on that.
So what did the thing that kicked all this off have any use cases in it?
Yeah, what they tell us in the original brief that they're working from, that would really help.
Guys, no. There were rough use cases here, but first of all, this is Future of Text general meeting, and Brandel is here. And I know he's had really valuable feedback, but I think we can maybe talk about some of the issues that were in the emails, and we saved most of this for Thursday, because the questions and issues you're raising are probably good to get on that record. All I'm trying to say is that we should keep it positive and small. It is about presenting regulation, not analysis. It's going to be for a small part of the government to begin with, but different sources in. The company that my friend has, they've already done work for the National Health Service and so on. So they have good experience in this. This is not completely new to them in any way. But I just suggested that because she's a friend, I saw her at our garden party. It wasn't even planned. Talk to some of you guys. But looking into the future of our meetings, it seems there's a bit of a summer holiday for a lot of us at the moment. We should probably look a little bit about how we can use our time So there's been these two topics. I'll probably send out another email to the group suggesting when we should have it. But Brandel, we are hoping you will want to present to the group. Maybe this is a good time for you to do that soon, you being the monthly host. And I think we should maybe even have a reboot of talking about text and work in virtual reality. It's been 6 months. So maybe we should try do a whole pretend we're new.
Yeah, yeah, that would be neat. I must admit I haven't done a lot of work on text and virtual reality of late. Something that has been interesting is on reading. I've just been finally sort of picked up to properly read through AZTDR, the Designers Republic A to Z that they released in 2019. And it's a big, uncomfortably large book, and all of the artwork in it is, I don't know if you're familiar with Designers Republic, but they did and do poster work out of Sheffield from '86 to present. Yeah, Anderson, Ian Anderson, the guy who started it, says in the book that everything relates to everything else, and something that he doesn't say, but it's true, is that there's no intrinsic scale. So most of the things have had to be massively shrunk down. There's not enough space for all of the commentary that he wants to have. And all of those things together kind of point to me to being sort of a perfect exemplar of where a navigable virtual space would be a much better thing for the manipulation and the creation of relationships and trails and all of the kinds of things that hypertext is good for, but also a hypertext that entails space that allows work to be kind of arranged and presented in a way that is like adequately sympathetic to what it is. Yeah, it was just interesting thinking about the way that medium crushes all of that up a little bit, and how much more you could get out of being able to kind of stand in a big room with these various things and conjure the next one or see options and stuff like that.
I got an email today from Mark Bernstein that relates to that. Let me read it to you. It's in relation to the reply to upcoming relationship and reading. So he says, a question for you on which you will likely know the answer, at least can point me to a reference that does. Suppose we have a VR or AR world that is designed so that for a user of average vision, there is exactly as much information in view as the user can perceive, not more, not less. How much information is there? I want to say how many pixels, but perhaps that is not the precise unit. I think it's relevant for your question because even in a physical castle, if we were kings and we owned a castle, we couldn't store all the information in the world. It takes effort to remember how to go. So there are even limits in VR, but it's a different kind of limits.
Absolutely. Yeah. But so the answer that, resolution is kind of described, and size and stuff is described by most people in industry by various explanations of angular arc. The simplest thing is a fellow who came up with it at Google, Chris McKenzie, presented in 2017, DMMs, the idea of something being a millimeter tall from a meter away as a basic unit, and saying that buttons should be 38 DMM, and various windows might be sort of 500 or 1,000 DMM. So,
do you have a link to a good one on that?
Yeah, I can find the Google I/O talk about it.
Thanks. Mark, I spy your hand.
Yeah, I was just sort of reflecting on the passing comment that Brennan made about the opportunity to get sort of tractability with things like trails and links, because I can bring you to bear some experience, albeit in somewhere else, but really since 2004, the sort of weird knowledge community that I've effectively been supporting with Mark Bernstein's tool. The thing I'm beginning to reflect on is that half the Sturm und Drang at the outset of anything is people they're so obsessed with outcome that they almost will not, to their own detriment, invest any effort in the one thing they've turned up for. So the starting point is, I have a problem that doesn't work in any other tool I've used because they're all too something. And so you said, well, what are you trying to do? So, and what that says, I want an answer. It's really what it decodes as. And the success comes out of saying to them, that's fine, there will be an answer, but let's start somewhere else. Let's actually, work out what you're trying to do. And so I think that going back to, in a sense, earlier in the conversation, you're saying, well, where can we be bold and thoughtful about this? Is to get back to that thing about being less obsessed with the, less focused on what the outcome is, but actually think about the tools that will enable you to get to that outcome, to get them to the point where they're the kind of things that people will be able to use because they're so blindingly obvious when they're presented with them. Because if you think of lots of things we use now, we sort of tend to forget that on their way to being the really useful things we have, an awful lot of development, some accidental, some deliberate, went into them getting to that state. And so I sort of sense that's an area where, we can make some improvements and some input.
Yeah, I mean, I admit I am guilty of that. I'm guilty of, it can get kind of easy to get into playing with the tool for the tool's sake. And it's a more serious thing to care about the outcome. But, in many cases, you kind of need to know the process to get the outcome. Well,
it's part of the problem. It's interesting you say that, because one of the things we try and learn the tools, we think, well, in order to understand this, I better have an outcome, partly because I'll know whether I've figured it out or not, because I can get to the outcome. The one thing I know at the moment is I can't get to the outcome because I didn't even know how the tool works. But the sort of the difficulty is, the more abstract from our own experience the tool or the process is, the more we tend to basically follow the steps of somebody else, which gets us into the outcome mode, rather than being presented with this beautiful smorgasbord of sort of tools that all do various different parts of the things. Witness the sort of all the prototypes that Fabian and Brandel people, and sort of have done. So, oh right, actually, if I use this and this and this combination, I can do this thing that doesn't necessarily come to any particular outcome, but what it does do is it shifts you from one part of the problem space to another, and possibly very, very quickly, or with great ease, or it abstracts away something that seemingly would have been very complex before. And that's the thing that I keep coming back to when I look at the sort of the VR space. It's taking things that we've made quite hard-edged because we put them in books, or we put them on screens, or we do this, to the tractability and plasticity we have stored up here. Where we're less worried about that. So I think VR offers us the opportunity to have something that's not looser edged and closer to our broad way of thinking, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. But one thing that I think would be really good if we start thinking about is, I had to write a really brief thing to Aspasia today, for example. Forget the fact that it's regulation stuff, but just writing it's so annoying that the general way of writing is still so gosh darn linear. Not that I was going to give her a hypercard stack or anything like that. But I think in our community, we need to. I think it would be really valuable if we start thinking about what reading and writing is again. There's so many amazing things happening in the commercial world, like the tapbacks on the iPhone. It's insane. You click on message, you do a thumbs up or an exclamation mark. It adds a completely different level and okay. There's got to be more visual means of communication and more serious things we can do too. And also how we connect things is so siloed. You know, one thing is a citation, another one is a hyperlink, another one is it's that thing on my desktop. And then there's the spatial hypertext again. You know, it's a complete mess. You know, we have this fetish of VR, at least I do. I'm using it in a fun, positive sense, that, you know, you can have things in a room and it can relate. But there's a huge amount of infrastructure, of course, to make that possible, as I know everyone here knows. But even if it is possible, to make it actually useful is really, I think it's going to be really difficult. You know, we have the initial question, you know, with the internet, all the information is available at your fingertips. Great. What does that mean? And now we can say all the information can be available anywhere. What does it actually mean? So for this simple thing today with Aspasia, all I wanted to do is show her that I had read the brief. So I, you know, a bit of paraphrasing and a few links, that's okay. But then there is me trying to say essentially the stuff we've been talking about, do a small bit, maybe the user testing should be like this, and we should look at doing something here. How would we present that in a virtual environment? Would we have posters on the wall? Would we have avatars holding the information up? Would we have video? It's quite fascinating, isn't it? Like, you know, you could say people have this horrible sentence, a picture tells more than 1,000 words. Yes, but you do actually have to decide every single thing that's going to be in the picture, whether it's a photograph or digital. So you probably, in most cases, could write a sentence that communicates it well enough than arranging an entire scene to fill 47 megapixels worth of information, right? It's similar in VR. Yes, VR is incredibly rich, but how can we use it? Mark?
Yeah, so what I'm so hearing coming out of this in a way that there's one tension that's in there is that the mind palace I create for myself may have to differ significantly from the version of the mind palace I share with anybody else but me, because some of the things that I may put in my mind palace only make sense to me and are almost unexplainable. They are that personal that they are unexplainable to somebody else. And I'm not saying that to be sort of difficult or contrarian, but it does seem to me an important thing to understand that. So there are two modes potentially here in this space. There is one which is broadly explanatory, designed to be shared, which gets back to the notion of things like Bush's trails, where they are effectively expository. If that's what you are trying to expose something to somebody else, you're trying to show a relationship or something, or more personal things where often you can have a much looser structural association. And the difficulty comes that the richness is in the latter picture, and yet we want to force it through a communicative medium. And I still think that VR in what it loosely offers at the moment is richer than forcing it through maybe, you know, a linear document. But I think one of the things I'm sensing is missing is, I mean, do we have a sense of how you might do trails? And I'm deliberately not going to say lines because they have a sort of salience all of their own and often unuseful. It's more the sense of, if this thing is linked with that thing, how do I know they're linked, and how do I indicate the reason for the linkage? Because I think the links, once you have the fluidity of a virtual space, can be much more transient because they can be contextual. One of our problems at the moment is the way that we write things down. Effectively, you know, it comes, we draw lines or boxes, or we make hard-edged things, is that that we give them more prominence than perhaps we want. It's very hard, for instance, to draw a diagram where there are lots of bits and they have an interconnection, because you can't share them all at once because it's too visually too busy. If you take them away, then you don't see what you don't see, depending on what your sort of training is in terms of understanding potentially ambiguous information. So it seems to me that an interesting and very central question here is how you make manifest trails in a VR space. Because that's quite a fundamental enabler. And I'm not suggesting I know the answer is easy to do, but I do think it's something that probably note that other people will, other areas of work will not necessarily be thinking to do that, because it wouldn't be on their plate.
Yeah, I think that goes on the topics I'm suggesting, how information connects. There is a really rich opportunity there to discuss it. And what I would really like is if a few of us decided to do 5-minute presentations, for a 2-hour meeting where, one can maybe say exactly what you said here. It's hard to be fuzzy, into premature formalism, or some funny phrase you had, is important. That's a valuable thing to have in this, and to have other ones. Yeah, it's information is a mess. It always will be. But how are we going to deal with it step by step? Randall, please.
Something that's been on my mind. I mean, I learned it a long time ago, but it still appears to be true, is that only 10% of people know that Find On page on desktop computers exists, let alone on phone. In Android, it may be a little clearer than it is in Safari, but it's really bleak as a picture in terms of the fact that people know that proximally, obviously, that they simply can't do that, but more generally, that they exist in a world in a way that means that they haven't needed it enough to discover it, or that they simply don't have that ability. I think it's dire, and so something that I'm very interested in pursuing, at least with Safari, but hopefully to alter the state of the art, is to say, like, how do we present the web in a way that means that the idea of Find On page is self-evident? And what are the flow-on effects for concepts like search? Something that I think about a lot in the context of using Chrome and Safari is that if you select a piece of text and right-click, some websites will actually turn that into a sort of a soft link, in some sense, of saying, like, here's a term, you've identified this term, here's what we know about that term, even if it wasn't a hyperlink. Then you have things like Bloomberg that have info boxes about every single company, irrespective of why it was referenced in that particular article, and that can be kind of hilarious as well. Sometimes it's even mistaken, so it's just like Apple's. Like, I'm glad that Braeburns are worth this many $1 trillion. That's cool news. But yeah, I think that the navigability that flows from having this awareness that text is not just information that exists on a screen, but potential soft handles that can exist for the manipulation of something. One, it's interesting too, something that I'm also aware of from the context of building Apple.com and other websites, is that it's aesthetically and informationally somewhat at odds with the goals of the people who present the image of stuff, the image of the website in a certain way. I hopefully slightly hyperbolic, but when Omar was saying that the Apple aesthetic has a fascist aspect, it's not entirely off in terms of the way that it's this presentation of a singular particular view of this is right, this is what we decided to put there. And at a certain level, I think that it would be useful to think of the web's job as being slightly antithetical to that. So yeah, I feel like spaces, navigation, linking and referencing, one of the things that I believe that starts with is what can be done with pages, how can people find on pages, and once they've identified words, what do they do with them, and how can we present that in all of the contexts that we have now and will have continuing into the future.
I'm just opening a document here as we're talking. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there are two sides to this in a sense. One side is educating the user, and another one is educating the tool or improving the tool. The thing that I've been talking about for quite a few years now, and it goes in and out of fashion with me, is the notion of deep literacy. that's what I really want to leave behind. And that is the idea that it's okay to know your shit, right? And it's a bit weird to say that, because when, you know, the last 20 years of laptops, you see somebody at Starbucks, preferably wearing a suit. I wear a suit a lot, so I'm allowed to say that. The way they sit with their machines, specifically Windows, is they are as far away as possible, right? And they tap. It's like they're a little bit disgusted that they have to use this corporate thing, and they usually have a not a, you know, they don't usually go to the Apple store and decide they want to buy the fanciest machine. Some people do it out of pure snobbery, of course, but the people who decide that I need this for my work, you know, craftspeople used to do that. You know, you would have to have the right kind of a plumb. You would have the right kind of pencil. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the right kind of line. All of this is so important to get back. And what really baffles me is the pop culture icons of our age, sports people. They wouldn't be seen dead in anything but the best equipment, the best bike, the best car, the best shoes, whatever. They understand the importance of really owning their tools, right? And of course, musicians, actors, everybody, they understand that. But for some reason, we have this nerd thing going that if you really know Command F, oh, what a nerd. I do, however, see it shifting a little bit. One of the best things that happened to this is Facebook, because it's educated a notch of the population to tagging pictures, at least that's a pleasurable thing for them now. So I'm really wondering, I mean, you know, Brandel, hang on, just quick screen share because I can. So I'm a keyboard person, and I really think other people should drive with both hands on their steering wheel, you know, both hands, keyboard and trackpad. So in Author and Reader, Command F shows you all occurrences with the headings immediately. It really bothered me that on the web page, when you do that, all it does is try to draw little yellow bits where you aren't. But there are so many ways you should be able to manipulate the pages, you know, fold it, see all the defined terms, see all the names in the document.
Well, I was reminded having to use PowerPoint the other day that most Microsoft things won't even they will not let you select a word. It will always invariably select some white space that you didn't ask to be selected.
Yeah,
lots of which I've never understood.
Yeah, these are important issues. So I think we need to build better tools and show them in use. I mean, people on TikTok, for instance, it's really quite advanced usage. You can have a split screen comment on someone, you can stitch something, there are hashtags, there are all these things that the quote unquote kids are using these days. But I think we have lost out because we still use the old language. Like we talked about the other day about hypertext is dead. Now we just have web links. You know, a lot of, you know, we don't talk about these people as learning video editing and video communication. I mean, I showed one to Emily yesterday, this girl doing a very girly thing. And, you know, she walks to the camera and she walks past it, but you can actually see the shadow of the wall. You see her reaching to turn the video off, the record button off, right? And it's just so charmingly naive, but they do it. You know, she doesn't care that she didn't edit those few seconds. But how can we bring this into the domain of text and knowledge things? How can we encourage this deep literacy? I mean, it's almost antithetical to Apple, apart from for your pro apps. Everything has to be, let's do the airs, intuitive, right?
But it's interesting you mentioned the keyboard, because of course the one you have on most haptic devices is no keyboard. I'm not saying that, and I'm not taking a position on that. It just strikes me as, I mean, one of the reasons I don't use haptic devices is that I actually quite like a keyboard. And that's not because, you know, quite literally, because also, you know, if I had a phone, if I've got, you know, I have a phone this big, the fact that I can actually find something in the page is fine, but I haven't got a big enough screen to do anything useful with the stuff that I found, which is why. Yeah. you know, actually, if I need to do that, I will put the phone down and I'll go and find a sensible device to do the work on. I mean, but then I'm lucky because I'm you know, most of the time in a setting like I am at the moment where those things are to hand.
But this is,
But I'm very conscious that's not where most people's life is lived.
it is, because that's why Apple keeps pushing the keyboard for the iPad, which is an absurdity, but there you go, makes sense in reality.
Well, yes, an iPad obviously is almost this crossover position, isn't it? And I don't know at what point you go from being on a very large phone to a very small computer, and obviously there will be some cross flow. But I was just thinking that and yes, you can attach a keyboard to a iPad. I'm sure you can get one that works with a phone if you're so minded.
Yeah, but
if you're typing your novel.
Apple's really pushing the keyboard. I think this is an acknowledgement that if you're going to do any work that, you know, beyond basic, you really do need a keyboard. So I think what you're saying.
But they never seemed to go anywhere, but there was that thing where people were doing sort of laser keyboards where you didn't have a keyboard at all, but you had a thing that looked at you, followed your fingers, and you just tapped on the, you know, the tray table on your train seat or whatever, and that actually struck me as really quite sensible. I mean, you know,
Well, yeah,
others
you
might take a view
that.
of, well, why are you still basically typing on an invisible QWERTY keyboard? But at some point, you know, you have to have some bridge, technical bridge from where we are to where we might go.
So, Brendel, you would know the statistics behind this. I assume that a lot of people go to the apple.com webpage just with an iPhone. It's probably 40%, I'm guessing, out of thin air.
Nope.
Much more?
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously, but when you're talking about, like the
on a
case,
given week, it's more like 75.
okay. Oh, all right, that makes sense. But okay. So when you talk about the example of find on page, are you predominantly talking mobile phone usage or desktop or iPad usage? Just in your own
10%. So the 10% figure refers to desktop computers or computers, laptops included. I can only imagine that the phone equivalent is an order of magnitude or two lower, given the sort of the real estate and the discoverability of those features.
Okay, so just being stupid here. Let's say someone is on a web page on their iPhone, and there is a capability where they can speak, show me, blah, blah. If that was possible with Siri knowing the context of the app that's in front, and show me means that, do you think that's the kind of thing that would get into the public's consciousness if it was marketed on TikTok and so on by cool influencers? Or do you think it would have to be a strong visual cue, click me and I can do more?
I think you can get a certain way. I mean, one funny thing is that a lot of the time there are neat features of devices or applications, and they're actually central parts of Apple marketing for a particular thing, sort of like using your watch to find your phone. But until there's a TV commercial about it, then it doesn't really come up. So again, like I was saying with the regulation stuff, marketing isn't just sort of fancy advertising executives that drinking highballs in the afternoon. It's actually devoting resources to making people aware in the first place of something existing, and it's an absolute necessity. So yes, I think if that happened, it would also need to make sense in the context of a suite of other things. So if it simply existed and no other changes occurred to Siri, then it would be a challenge to have the sort of collective consciousness of everybody remember in and of itself that it's a capability that exists. If Siri were to change in a way that meant that sort of made sense in the constellation of capabilities, then it would be a lot easier. And
Yeah, that's very intelligent.
And
Okay.
okay. I love it. I love it. I love the dimensionality of it. I like that it's elevated as well.
Yes.
And one of the neat things about that is that once people are aware of it and think about it, that they may become interested in how to do it without the assistance of something like a Siri, and be able to have enough an awareness of that capability that they would look for it on desktop.
Listen to Brendel. Hang on a second.
Look for how to do it just through the menu systems and stuff like that. So yeah. That would be
Artist and the family. Is that an airplane? Is that me?
Yes, and this is a mouse, and this is these, and the mouse ate half of the paper.
Oh no, guys, did you see the mouse ate half the paper? You can see the mouse there.
a vicious mouse.
Breaking the fourth wall. That's fantastic. Breaking the fourth wall on a piece of paper. Right. So the thing that is really fascinating me about Siri is that, of course, you have to learn a vocabulary to use Siri or any kind of a voice assistant. But it seems to be getting better. But for the specific challenge you're talking about now, you should talk to Bruce Horn, who's just started and he's working on Siri. He's not the boss of Siri by any means, but he is certainly the boss of enthusiasm. He really, really wants to push it for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm just looking him up in the directory to see where he is and what his disclosures are.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. I'm being...
Sorry, I'm trying to read Brandel's glasses here now.
You wouldn't know what the numbers mean.
Because I can reveal that today I learned that you could do find on page in Safari on a phone. Mainly because I just don't use it. For reasons I've already explained. But what's interesting, and I see Brandel's point, is actually how hard it is. Because, for instance, with only this much room, so your trigger point is you select something. You manage to indicate whether you actually select it or you do some action that says, okay, this is relevant. The distance between there and being able to access the feature is vast. As far as I can work out, one of the things you have to do also is you have to start fiddling with the URL of the current page. Now, which always scares me because I can't remember how I got to the page I'm on at the best of times, and now I'm busy sawing off the branch on which I'm sitting. Yes, I know I can go back to the history, but I'm just thinking in terms of in the moment. So that the difficulty of, I mean, I'm not surprised people don't know, because you'd have to really want to use it. You wouldn't casually find that thing, and that's interesting. I mean, it also explains why I never assumed it was even possible.
But the amazing thing, I mean, there's got to be a Siri introduction to Siri. That's got to be made. It just doesn't seem to be easy to find what Siri can do. It's never up to date. But we have Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the house. The way I communicate with them, I click on the Siri button, I speak translate to Russian, blah blah blah, and it does it. It never makes a mistake. It's absolutely insane. It gets my voice perfectly every time. So the base capability now is vastly more powerful than it was even a few years ago. So to add more sophisticated things like, I can, to do a search now is easy. I just say search blah, 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 and it gives me the results, and it's fantastic. But to then have this layer of something on the page, if it's made, I think it could be made understandable by a lot of people too. It just purely because of the reliability of the underlying system.
How does that work if you'll say you're in a busy office of 30, 40 people who are all saying, hey Siri?
I'll show you. Talk. Everybody.
Hey Siri.
Translate to Russian. Mark, can you please be quiet? You were all supposed to be talking then. Okay.
Hey Siri, how are you doing, Siri?
Okay.
What do you
that
think
was
of
the
Alexa?
speaker in the corner of the room that did it, because my
Hey Siri, set an alarm for 3 a.m.
Set your alarm for 3 o'clock tomorrow.
Thanks.
Yeah.
But hang on, I'm just going to go with my normal camera. I'm wasting
But I didn't make the observation because I'm in any way sort of disparaging the system.
no, but
What I was getting at was that, you know, there are some
Russian. Mark, what are you talking about?
if I go and sit in a cafe, then, you know, it's sort of an acceptance
Russian,
that I
Mark
may
was
be
talking about
speaking,
is-
even if only to myself, as opposed to, you know, and the other people around me will be speaking. If I go into a,
Mark, I can give you the answer. You hold it
Yep.
close to your face. That's it.
oh, I hate that. I hate.
No, but hang on a second. We're not talking about, this is the only interaction you will have with your devices ever, right? But
No, exactly. I wasn't making that point. What I was thinking about is the fact that, well, you know, it's like we went from a stage. It used to be that reading was something was sort of you were read to, and it was an out loud experience, and then we went into silent reading, and we now seem to be moving from a point where we silently read or silently interacted with these informational devices, and maybe now we're talking to them because it's too complicated otherwise to interact with them. I don't know, just an interesting shift, that's all. And not every location allows for that.
I think, unless you're in a library, I think every location does. Not always, but what is amazing, you know, the Apple Watch, I just did that while you were talking on purpose.
Mhm.
Because if I click that button and then I talk,
Mhm.
walking down the street, even if it's really loud, like I was in Oxford Street today, you know, that's how I communicated with Emily. Click, tell my wife, blah, blah, blah. And boom, there it goes. It has gotten to the point where, and also I've been very wary about this, you know, like the whole Blade Runner talk, zoom in, so and so. No, it's much easier to click and drag or whatever. But the capability is incredible now. So I think what Brandel is talking about, and I know Brandel, you didn't say it should be all Siri, but when you are concentrating on a piece of web, having Siri as an additional level of interaction is now achievable.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, yeah, that sort of tendency for having agentive intermediation that makes sense in that context. Having the idea that there's an agent that's doing stuff, and coming up with an appropriate interface with that agent through to the sort of work surface becomes a sort of separate problem. And there are times when, sorry, go ahead.
No.
There are times when using that model, even without sort of oral discussion, has the ability to sort of set the scene, as it were, for how those interactions occur as well. It's worth thinking about in the context of Safari.
You also mentioned something along the lines of the bigger picture, so to speak. So I'm thinking about maybe the trigger for Siri in this context could be page. So, you know, if someone learns they can give a command of the page, they can do something like scroll page if you have accessibility issues, right? Search on page, make page text bigger. Provided there is a page, then if you use the word page, it knows you're talking about that and you don't want something else random. You know,
Make the text bigger. Yeah, it does not do that right now. If you're in Safari and you invoke Siri, then
but you can also do share page, email page. You know, those are useful things. It's really fascinating. Being a future of text guy until VR, this stuff would horrify me. I'm glad someone else would do it, but now I think it is within our remit to look at this because, you know, let's pretend we're talking about sexuality. We're comfortable enough in our skin as text people to allow ourselves to talk. You know, other interfaces are available.
It's interesting as you mentioned the share menu, which is something that I suppose I should dive back into more because I suppose because the last time I really looked at it, all it was full of was rubbish. No, I didn't want to tell this to my mum on Twitter. No, I didn't want to, because it mostly seemed to be about attention and social media things, partly because those are the people who got their foot in the door first, and I don't blame the designers of the medium for that. The sad thing is that it's a sort of pivot point or an access point that is quite powerful. In other words, there probably should be quite a lot of useful things in there that, if they aren't in there, they may well possibly easily be put in there. And if we bother to use them, that would be a general gain. But you've got to fight your way past all these, sort of 4 layers of logos that have been stuffed in there by something you half looked at a week ago, or someone said, no, look, you've really got to install this in order to see it. And that is also a problematic design thing, because all the Drex sits on top, and the useful stuff is pushed way out of context for you.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the share menu, there is a lot of crap there. I mean, when you try to share something on the desktop, it's a sub menu and it's kind of hidden. Actually, no, it's not even there now. Oh yeah, share ... It doesn't even have a sub menu. But a lot of the infrastructure is there, and it's yeah. I see your weirdness with that, Mark. I've also had issues. Peter?
Well, it's partly, sorry, Peter, go ahead.
All right.
Yeah, has anyone used Siri to build a simple hypertext authoring capability? Sort of like, set Frode Hagelin, birth date, 9/16, whatever. Set wife, Emily, set son, Edgar, and then be able to retrieve afterwards, Siri, son, Frode Hagelin, and get the answer back.
I don't think that's what Siri is really for. It is not to create stuff generally. It's to communicate or retrieve. Over to you, Brandel.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of any current capability that will allow people to sort of define Siri's operations and activities in such a way that you'd be able to use Siri to add functionality to its existing application. I may be wrong, but that's not something that I'm aware of out there. People have played with things and pretended that they're Siri in web, because there's speech recognition in Chrome, and then synthetic speech that you can generate there. So so I've actually built bits and pieces of when I make WebGL experiments, I have the sort of particular sliders, the blue on the dark gray and things like that. That thing is called Dat GUI. I was playing with the concept of making a Dat VUI, such that you would be able to have phrasing that you could refer to query and set values through a voice intermediated experience, not least so that you could make use of it in virtual reality when you don't have particularly ready access to visualizations there, and so that you could also orally query specific sort of arrangements and questions and things like that.
Right, because I've always wanted to be able to make an object attribute value association verbally. If I had a watch, I could do that and then retrieve it later on.
Yeah. So
it'd be really handy.
Be possible. Yeah, so I think that would be possible in Mac OS. It wouldn't be understood to be coming through Siri per se at this point. I believe that there's dictation stuff and there's synthetic speech, but it's not sort of presented as though that is notionally Siri. But yeah, no, it would be a really cool thing. I beyond the fact that the general accessibility frameworks that exist should be able to allow somebody to drive such a relational system through oral commands. I don't know that anybody's built one with that particular goal in mind. And so I think it's really interesting and really compelling as a concept.
Did Siri start out as a I mean, I so rewind back. And I think my mispresumption was simply because my head wasn't in that space at the time. Was when these things emerged, I thought, okay, this was someone having another crack at speech to text, and then they're doing clever stuff, and because they have the text. This being the point that it was speech to text, and then they were doing clever stuff with the text they got out of it, rather than perhaps perhaps it was the case that actually that wasn't quite the way they conceived it. What they conceived it was that the whole point was that you did something. In other words,
Right.
text to speech was incidental. It was just to get you to the point where you could do something by voice, which is similar but different, and I accept that.
I really want to be able to use. I really want to be able to use voice to add information into the system, as opposed to only being in retrieval mode all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it carries the same challenge that text adventures carry, which is that the expressive space is so wide that it is difficult to know how to encode those things. So, typically, we use. At best, we use free text to do encoding, input into a system paired with voice, possibly because people just like to be able to kind of speak freely and do that, but also partly because being able to make use of you're sort of even more at the mercy of the accuracy of the translation of the parsing of the speech, in order to make sure that it's kind of obeying the appropriate syntax tree to be able to kind of be a meaningful statement in the context of a rich system. To your question, Mark, Siri was, so one thing, Apple has a very, very long history with synthetic speech, back to Speak, Speak, created with the Reed College Rascal Development Program. Siri was started at SRI, and at that time, it was a hard-coded rule-based system for being able to do some very basic parsing around domains and they were explicitly generated domains around movie tickets and sports events and things like that. And it was, shall we say, very enthusiastically, if not oversold, to executives as being much more general than it really was, and it took the ML and AI team years to undo the damage of the misunderstanding of what it was. So at this point, it is still comparatively domain specific, but it is in comparison, for example, to Google searches. But it is much more general and generalizable. So that it was about identifying domains and then answering with expert systems that were trained in those domains with some limited set of grammars that it was supposed to be processing and parsing.
It's a little more complicated than that, the history of Siri, I have to say, to be on the record. But there was also privacy issues, of course, where Apple had to remove a lot of knowledge about the end user and all of that good stuff. But then I don't have any issue with privacy if it's about me for myself. So there is that thing, if it's for someone else or something else. The whole speech angle, I think we really can happily continue talking about, because speech doesn't steal away from text. It's still part of the future of text. It can add a really useful parallel dimension. I mean, one of the things Apple has just done with the speech to text is that it now, on the phone at least, allows you to have your keyboard up while it's running. So it becomes more interactive, and it also does a better job at punctuation. This is fantastically useful stuff to be able to go between the different modes. And, even Emily is shocked at the use of her watch. I mean, today in town, I left my mobile phone in my bag most of the day. It just wasn't necessary. If I needed a message, this is enough. But it certainly isn't where I would write my thesis, obviously.
One other thought for helping speech-based data input systems is that we could use tongue clicks and whistles to provide punctuation for the system to help it parse and distinguish different sub-utterances.
You're always so reality-based.
I'm now imagining a Starbucks full of people whistling and clicking.
Well, I mean, there will be evolutions where this stuff will read our intonations. That can't be that far off. You know, it won't. I'm not saying it'll be human, but it'll be able to tell whether you're angry or not.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I think in the most recent WWDC, they had question marks and commas, exclamation marks being added to bodies of text. So it's one of those things where it's obviously a component of grammar in the same sense that words are. It's just that I believe it had been excluded for the benefit of the ease of processing. You know, it's similar to, so if you write pathfinding algorithms for state space search, there's the gold standard is A*, which is a form for graph search that you can use for playing tic-tac-toe, but you also play it for Command and Conquer. And in Command and Conquer or Warcraft or whatever, what you have is a grid-based system, and you can traverse squares, and you have the straight line distance as an estimate of how far away it is. And so even though you have vehicles that have limited turning circles, they were initially always encoded as though they could turn in any direction at any time, because once you have a limited sort of ability to turn, then the state space becomes much larger than merely the literal space, because you have being here but facing this direction, and being here and facing this direction. And if you have I learned the hard way once. I was like, this is boring. Let's make it so that it's also specifically what direction you're facing it. But there's, you know, combinatorial explosions are very, very common in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so anything people can do before they have the real sort of algorithms and infrastructure to put it behind it is try to pare down those things as much as possible. So it's interesting. There are always a number of things that those people, graphics researchers, AI researchers, have up their sleeve, where they're like, well, if these parameters change in terms of the computational environment we exist within, then we'll be able to do this other thing with them. That was the thing that I mentioned in that Ed Catmull podcast last week. Something that he's acutely aware of and started acutely aware of is not just what can I do now, but what are the characteristics of the things that I can imagine doing, such that if something were to change by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, which they have so far, I would be able to get away with doing on the CPU every millisecond or something like that. And it's a really interesting component, not just of, you know, being technical or being a programmer, but being a technical researcher, is that you get to, and sometimes have to, entertain things that are just patently implausible right now, because, you know, remembering them in case somebody makes some stupid breakthrough that just changes the landscape entirely. You're like, oh, let's do this on it.
I think Peter's issue with being able to add through voice is kind of important, because one of the things it could potentially do is run rings around issues in VR where the room you're in can be owning too much. Maybe if the audio can go to the room, but also to your own process running in the background. You know, like you take your assistant with you, then you have less of a siloed approach to adding and getting information. So if, for instance, Apple's Siri, which I assume will be part of the VR environment, does this, then when you're looking at a manuscript, you should be able to say, add to my library so-and-so, and that potentially should work. Because if you have to interact with it in a different way, that could be difficult.
Yeah, there are some Kai and Wist papers around sort of social, socially mediated sort of computer control and what you want to share and what you want to withhold. You know, if you think about people playing a game of Settlers of Catan, if you're into that sort of thing, then there are a number of actions and deliberations and questions and answers that you want to be able to get, that you want to be able to share, and some that you really don't. And so there's an interesting sort of social grammar aspect to any of those activities, where sort of federated degrees of trust need to obtain about how you divulge certain sort of system operations. I'll try to find them, because that is public research that I've seen, and it's really interesting. I actually don't know who cares inside Apple about that kind of stuff either, but yeah, like I think it's germane in the context of like, what would the future of Siri be? It's yeah, like, how can you, like, could encoding in the sense of having code words that you agree on with Siri be a way to be able to kind of have certain actions happen as well?
That's
in the
nice.
same way there's, you know, in the same way that we talked about fleeing from abusive partners in the last keynote, like if there is a broader domain of encodings that people can have with Siri to mean things so that they can sort of do things safely. That's interesting.
Yeah, code words is an interesting thing. And have you all seen the series Altered Carbon on Netflix?
I read the book. I haven't seen the series.
God, who is that? Someone trying to call. Bizarre. Okay. There are some nice visuals and how they interact with some of their of the synthetic people. That makes me think of what you were talking about there. That's all. Peter?
Yeah, also, if we're going to have individual voice assistants listening in on the audio from a room, we need to get away from having cryptic GUI identifiers and move to Jeff Raskin's humane naming concept. So you could speak out loud in the room, you know, 7 pink hyperactive snail darters, and that could be your index into some data object that your assistant would then be able to look up over the open web to retrieve, you know, 20 gig worth of CSV files. And Siri would be able to pick that up easily, as opposed to having to wait 20 minutes while XM13Q-LR13 was read out into the room.
That sounds like you on a date.
Interestingly, something that arrived, I know, little thing. It's a thing called Velo, little company called Beeline. It's quite interesting, a little Kickstarter thing. I thought would be interesting, but it turns out to not be, because what it will do is it will give you sort of like turn-by-turn directions. So without having to put your very expensive smartphone on the front of your bike. But what I've realized is, in a sense, it's design Achilles' heel, is that unless you're the sort of person who never navigates, so it's just a mystery, you just follow the arrows, or you listen to the phone telling you where to go. This is because this connects to an app on here, and you can basically point at something and it'll find you a ride, and it'll do a sort of fastest, sort of medium, and a slow and picturesque route. But actually, in something like an urban environment, I can already see it doesn't really work very well, because it doesn't actually know where the little corners are, and when you ride regularly. So now you have a thing that knows where you want to go, but doesn't know the correct way round. Or you could sit down where you couldn't do it on a phone. You'd actually have to sit down at a computer and build yourself whatever, I can't remember the XML for route finding is, GFX or something. At which point you're thinking, why did I bother? Why don't I just ride the route, because I know where it is? And there's an interesting conjecture. I mean, I'll still find a use for this. I think it's quite nice. And if I was sort of going on a holiday or something and I wanted to plan a route, but I was quite surprised that it's a really nice idea. It's got lots of lovely stuff in it, but actually, it's one of those things where when you actually get to it, it doesn't really do anything useful.
That's an interesting sort of aspect of that sort of disclosure of how much information you believe you need to have in order to have adequate environment and context for what the information you're being fed is. I think it sort of is related to find on page, and that sense in which you probably want to know the context in which an answer or a claim exists versus turn left. I don't just turn left. And I think that's a really interesting provocation. Is what is the minimum viable package, both in screen and software, but also in terms of information to make it so that you are comfortable with the information being sort of asserted, like that you need to turn left here, as well as taking that further and saying, like, if I was an even less trusting person, what would I want to know about a map or a route? What are the pertinent details of my decision to make this left that I would need to be assured of, and then what way can those things be presented? So it's interesting to see it particularly as a failure case in that context, and also like who would be okay with that? What are the conditions under which they would be satisfied with it? And like you said, is it more a matter of the lead up to those decisions that in which case what is it providing? Because it might be something, but it might need to be based on sort of prearranged agreements where the little disc was like, okay, you agree that we should turn left here, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually very interesting you draw the analogy with the find, because I think it's a good case, because the bit where, to me, the quite elegant concept failed is that the issue isn't that it didn't get 99% of the route right. The issue was it got all the twiddly bits wrong. And the only thing, and then it's expecting you to use this and something this size to do really fine detail to fix the route. Because otherwise, every time you come to a slightly complicated junction, it's going to get its head knickers in a twist while it tries to figure out what you're doing. And that actually I'm just going out the other side of this junction, but there are a number of ways through it. And that often is the thing with find. You know what you want, but actually trying to indicate to the thing that you're interacting with, in this case the web browser, for instance, can be quite difficult. And that's even if you know some of the more advanced search syntax.
Now we're going into lots of different areas, but I mean, you wouldn't use voice for everything, and you wouldn't look for results on your phone for everything as well, right? But one thing that I think comes out of this issue is the question of source. So if it's anything more sophisticated than asking, Ronald Reagan's birthday or something, it would be really nice if you could follow up Siri with asking what the source is. Or, and the source could even have been a judgment call, if that's possible. I mean, with our Tesla, when we drive, we use the Google navigation that's built in, and it's really amazing. It takes into account traffic and all of that stuff. However, for some bizarre reason, right near where we live, it won't go the route we always go. It wants to go all over the place. And I can't fix that. But thankfully, that seems to be only here. But yeah. But anyway, a lot of these issues come with how things connect. So I look forward to figuring out a day to talk about that. And yeah, so Brandel, how is the move towards new responsibilities?
So today is a holiday, so I haven't had any follow-up since Friday. The incoming manager has said that she sees me as an individual contributor rather than a manager. I want to check with her whether that's just to do with sort of an initial plan or what. But yeah, in either case, it's the right team and the right thing to be working on. So I'm really looking forward to getting more context about what she sees as the vision for the organization and who I'm allowed to talk to and who I'm allowed to bug and to what extent anybody is supposed to listen to me. But yeah, like everybody inside the organization that I've spoken to about it has been absolutely thrilled to bits about the possibility of my being involved and wants to set up discussions about how we can work together to understand the scope of how we can do the future stuff. And yeah, it's interesting because there are, I mean, as you must have all noticed, that the vision for what computing was from I can't remember the folks before Otley and Lafontaine, all the way through Bush to Engelbart. It was always hypertext, and it was really always the forefront and the most exciting thing until it happened, and then everybody was completely sort of bored by the concept. They're just like, oh, that's just help systems and web pages and things, and it's phenomenal for that, the drama of it all, to have fallen away completely just as we began to have technical systems that could possibly support it. But that's, you know, the reality is that the web is the current manifestation of the most important and most interesting problem in computing, to my mind. I mean, you know, calculating you know, nuclear yields and ballistic tables is fine, but I think that, yeah, like the text, hypertext, and how we interact with the web is staggering in its scope, and also in terms of its potential impact on humanity. So yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people think that they're working on much more interesting things, and it's convenient that they happen to be wrong.
Well, it's nice to hear you talk like that, because one of the most tragic things in this history is, you know, Doug did his demo in '68 after years of struggling and fighting bureaucracy and all kinds of things. And then what happened around 1971? Xerox PARC, most of his engineers left. Why? As you know, as they told me to my face, more interesting problems, not more important, not more relevant, more interesting. Oh my God. So yes, I can imagine that there are many machine learning things that are more interesting for some people and all of this stuff. And that's great, more esoteric, but I completely agree with you.
Well, that's why I think it's really sad that actually microcosm sort of hit the streets quite when it did. And it completely sort of, in a sense, it was pushed completely aside by the web, which did far less. And of course, it was a desktop system at a time when not many people had network computers, let alone access to the web. And so people just didn't, I don't think the wider audience made the connection at all. But a lot of the richness that was in systems, of which that's probably the most sort of fully realized one, it still hasn't really been caught up with.
Are there videos about microcosm? Are there talks, presentations, that kind of
it
thing?
exists because I saved it from the scrapper, so you can actually build it and run it. It'll run on Windows 32 XP. So if you have a license for one of that, there are instructions. I can send you a link, but basically there's a bit. Bizarrely, Microsoft won't sell you XP, but they won't let you use XP without a license. I mean, even for academic purposes. So that's why, in fact, no, I can send, as long as you've got a license, I can send you probably the built or a link to the built thing. The thing I've been meaning to do is what it actually now needs, and I'm having real struggle getting the people who built it to just engage, to say what it now needs is a sort of kick-ass demo, but a kick-ass demo from today, not you selling the thing as you thought you were building, but to someone today sitting at school saying, why should I even care about this stuff? Right, look at all these things that we talk about that you can do here that actually they're only conceptually available at the moment, which I think would be a fabulous teaching tool. And it runs. I mean, I have it on. It actually lives on here in a virtual. It runs in VirtualBox. Sadly, not on my current thing because VirtualBox. I haven't found a virtualization software that simple enough for me to understand that runs on Apple Silicon yet. But I guess someone will probably fix that in due course. That's a sort of minor thing. So yeah, you will need probably a Wintel, an Intel chip Mac to do that. But yeah, no, it's alive, and it's rather like the thing I'm doing for Hypertext. I've just been amazed all the way along when you're trying to sort of recover anything. People keep saying, "Why bother?" It's the constant mantra. Why not build something new and sexy? Think, well, why not build something that actually does something?
Well, I mean, there are some people interested in history.
No,
Yeah,
indeed.
but
I generalize deliberately, and I accept that I'm generalizing. But it is a fascinating problem. But you know, I pulled one of these, two of these things out of the dumpster simply because otherwise we're fated to relearn, you know, the lessons of history.
Yeah, but Mark, when it comes to that issue, I have thousands of people asking me why I bother with text. Video is so much more useful. So, you know, there is that issue. But one thing I would really like us to discuss soon is to have a full session, I just realized now, on what can the web be? Because the web with VR will be something else. And one of the problems I have with the web is that the documents you have on your local system and the web are two separate boxes because they have to be. But to be, you know, so for instance, what really annoys me is if I have a link to an academic paper and that happens to be on my hard drive, you know, should it just link on the web or should it link to the hard drive? These issues of representation, addressability, connections, and so on will become something completely different with the work that Brandel's doing. And I think that it may be useful to have these discussions of, you know, we can even use the metaverse term every once in a while to see what is different between the web and metaverse. Is it purely that the metaverse is owned by a company, or as in it's an app type thing, or worse? These are really crucial discussions to have. And every time you bring up the past, Mark, you bring up so many ways that we use terminology before. And like we looked at legal documents, what did that word mean then? It's really important that we do that now as well. And on that note, I have to go, dinner's ready. Peter, you have your hand up as well. Any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest that Mark take a look at QEMU. It's an emulator that I read is supposed to be able to implement Intel instructions on ARM chip. So it might be possible to get some of the Intel stuff running on our new Macs using it.
Okay.
And I think the App Store has some sort of a front end to it, but I don't have a link to that handy.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
Fantastic. Thanks for coming, Brandel, on a holiday.
Yeah, good to see you.
No problem.
And we look
Thank you.
forward to Friday. Shall I just suggest some dates for these various things? And Brandel, you suggest a date when you're going to do a presentation. Should we do it like that?
Sure. Yeah. I'll think about what a presentation looks like and reread some of my source material. The trail for me on what exactly I mean by the implications for embodied cognition and extended mind are kind of a little cold, so I need to kind of refresh myself on it.
And there's no reason why you should do one presentation. If you want to do part 1 and part 2, that would absolutely be fine also.
I've got one quick question, actually. It's really for Peter and Brandel. It's completely unconnected with this, but you might just know. One thing I still have never been able to work out is how hypertext got into Windows Help. I think it's something to do with OWL and Guide, but I've never been able to find anything. It's just something that obviously no one thought was pertinent to write down. But if you think about it, you know, more people used Windows Help than, you know, in the birth of the web. There were lots of people using hypertext, didn't even know it, but they were using Windows Help all the time.
Yeah. I feel like so. You've brought that up here before, and I feel like maybe I've seen the question asked on Twitter as well. I don't know if Steven Sinovsky has weighed in on it, or what time when he sort of joined, or whether it actually needs to go to somebody like, I mean, be a big call, but to ask Bill Gates if he has any sense of it. Yeah, it's a fascinating question.
But it is interesting partly because if it is came via OWL, OWL came out of Guide, and Guide was arguably a completely different hypertext conceptual system to the sort of one that we're more used to. And that in itself is interesting. Anyway, just a bit of trivia, and you know that I'm still trying to run to ground.
All right, yeah, no, I think these are important bits. I want to put it on the timeline in the future of text as well. So when you find it, we'll put it in. All right, have a good week, everyone.
Okay, see you Thursday and Friday.
Yeah, look forward. Bye. And Brandel, if you wake up ridiculously early, 2 p.m. on Thursday, UK time, we'll be on the same channel. Bye for now.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.